Hey everyone, it's the Gadget Guru. With Exceeds coming to a table near you soon, I figured that I would go ahead and go over some of the rulings for Exceeds and kind of explain them a bit, because I've had a lot of people asking me a lot of rulings, what about this, what about this, what about this? So I thought I'd go over some of the rulings that they've already posted and, explain them a little bit. So let's go ahead and get started. First ruling is, can you use a face-down monster as an Exceed material monster? No. Exceed summoning is basically the same as synchro summoning in the sense. You use two monsters on your field where both levels can be identified, so you can summon a monster from your extra deck with an appropriate level. Now before, you added the levels, because if you had a 4 and a 2, you got a 6-star, and there was no exception. Now, you don't add the levels, you synchronize them. You have to make sure the levels are the same. So if you have 2 3s, 2 4s, put them together. Sometimes it requires more than that, 3 4s, whatnot. So you do that, you put them together, and you get a new monster. So first of all, since the levels have to match, this is going to rule out Exceed summoning in 90% of synchro decks. Synchro decks will stick with synchros. Exceed summoning is not for synchro decks. Understand that. That is one of the basic things I want you to understand. So you must use face-up monsters, same as synchro summoning. Okay, let's continue. When the Exceed monster is destroyed and sent to the graveyard due to battle or by card effects, what happens to the Exceed material monsters? When the Exceed monster leaves the field, the materials are then sent to the graveyard. The materials stay with the monster. It's kind of odd. When you Exceed summon, the monsters you used, you put them together, and then you put the new Exceed monster on top of them. And actually, the reason they did this is very interesting, actually. The reason Konami did this, why you don't put them in the graveyard, is because then you could bring them back and Exceed summon again. There's a lot of Reborn cards right now, and it'd be very easy just to bring monsters back and just keep cycling them, and it's way too easy. So, when you Exceed summon, you don't get the materials back into the graveyard. You have to keep them on the field. That prevents you from spamming Exceeds. Gadgets. But Gadgets and Ultimate Offering are going to find a way around it, because we're broken like that, but we won't go there. So, let's continue. So you have to, when the monsters are Exceed summoned, they do not go to the graveyard. When the monster is sent to the graveyard, the Exceed monster, then they go to the graveyard. What happens if an Exceed monster is removed from play by a temporary effect like Interdimensional Matter Transporter or Future Visions or something like that? What happens if that happens? In that case, the Exceed material monsters are sent to the graveyard, because they can't just exist. They can't just exist there. Just like they have to go somewhere, and you can't just bring all the cards with it. So they basically just go to the graveyard. I think that was kind of odd, but at the same time, I see why they did that. If somehow it gets, not Book of Moon, it does not. They still stay under it. Understand that. Don't think Book of Moon. If they get removed, if the monster gets removed somehow by some weird coincidence. What happens if the monsters return to the hand or deck by Compulsory or Phoenix Wind Blast? The Exceed material monsters are sent to the graveyard. So if it leaves the field, they're sent to the graveyard. That's how it works. They're equipped to it, so if it leaves the field, they go to the graveyard. It's like an equip card. If Book of Moon is used on Exceed material monster, what happens to Exceed materials? They stay on the field under the face-down monsters. Under the face-down monster. Sorry, not monsters. And the reason behind that is because the monster didn't leave the field. It's still there. Its position got changed. So it's still there, but it's just face down now. If a removal card is in play, such as Banisher of the Radiance or Macros Cosmos, etc., 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 is on the field, and the Exceed monster leaves the field, what will happen to the Exceed monsters? The Exceed materials are removed from the game. Now, a lot of people were saying, blah, 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 they won't be removed from the game because they're no longer cards, and this, and that, and this, and that, and this, and that. No. If there is a removal card in play, now, keep in mind, it has to be a generic removal card. Banisher of the Radiance, Macro Cosmos. We are not talking about Dimensional Fissure. The reason is, the generic cards remove everything. Period. Gone. So it has to be removed. Now, Dimensional Fissure and cards like it. Now, this is going to bend your mind a little bit, but bear with me and I will explain it. When when a Exceed Material monster is summoned and those cards are put under it, they are no longer monsters. They cease to be monsters. And the reason they did that is because if a card is activated, like Starlight Road, or no, sorry, if a card is activated like Dark Hole, whatever involving monsters, technically if they were still monsters, there would be 3 monsters in play on your opponent's side of the field. That's not the case anymore. There's now 1 monster, so it stops the activation of Starlight Road and stuff like that. Now this would also become a problem with samurais, because you could go summon a samurai, special a samurai, exceed summon, and then you could still use all your cards to say when you have a face-up 6 samurai, because they would still be monsters. That's why they're no longer monsters. So because they are no longer monsters, when they are sent to the graveyard, if a card is in play that specifically says, when a monster is sent to the graveyard, remove all monsters from play, they will not be affected by the effect because they are no longer monsters. Now, I know that's very hard to comprehend. Why is a monster not a monster? But they had to do it so that it didn't become broken for the other card effects they added for the XYZs and other archetypes. They had to do it. If I mind control an opponent's Exceed monster, what happens to the Exceed materials? They stay with it. They're always under it. Wherever the Exceed material monster goes, they go with it. Unless it goes to the hand or extra deck or whatever, then they go to the grave. But wherever it goes, they go. So if you creature swap, if you mind control, if you brain control, that might get unbanned in September from some rumors and crap, so I'm just putting it in there. If any of that happens, you take the Exceed material monsters as well. If Skill Drain is on the field, or an effect that negates monster effects, and you Exceed summon, what happens to the Exceed materials? They're still placed under the Exceed monster. Because remember, placing them under there is not an effect, it's a condition, it's a requirement to summon the monster. It's the same as, I don't know, what happens if I sync or summon with tokens? They go away. You still have to get rid of them or do whatever you have to do with them in order to sync or summon. So that's how Skill Drain or any effect like that would work. Here's an interesting one. Can a zombie carrier that is on the field through its revival effect be used as an Exceed material? If so, what happens to the Exceed materials? And it means zombie carrier, it means plague spreader if you don't know. So can a plague spreader be used if it's on the field? Blah blah blah. If so, what happens to the Exceed material monsters, and what happens to the Exceed material monster leaves the field? You may use plague spreader zombie as an Exceed material monster. When you use it as an Exceed material monster, the plague spreader zombie will become an Exceed material for the Exceed monster. When the Exceed monster leaves the field, the plague spreader zombie is sent to the grave. And yes, you may then use it again. This is the funny part. When you Exceed material using a monster, it no longer becomes a monster. So any previous conditions that were on that card, Spore, Unknown Synchron, Plague Spreader Zombie, any previous conditions that were on that monster are removed because it's no longer a monster. When the Exceed material monster leaves the field, they are sent to the graveyard. They are then reset. They become a card again. So it's a very interesting game mechanic. It's going to be really hard in a lot of ruling situations because it messes with the game so much. But I think it's very good and it's very cool that they did this. So you can use if you special summon Plague Spreader and use an Exceed material monster, he is not removed, he's put under it, and he's no longer a card. When that monster dies or is removed from the field, he then goes to the graveyard, because when he's being sent to the graveyard, he's no longer a card, so he has no effect. Once he hits the graveyard, he becomes a card again, so you can then re-special summon him. Okay, next ruling. If Sangan is used, blah blah blah, do you get the search? Is no longer treated as a monster, so it can't. Here's the definition they give, and I'll explain more. If a Sangan was used in an Exceed material monster, when it goes to the grave, do you get the search? And they say when the Sangan becomes an Exceed material monster, it is no longer treated to be on the field, therefore will not apply. Now, let me emphasize on that, because that is kind of confusing. And you're like, well, how is it not on the field? How is it not on the field? Because it is not a card anymore. Think of the monsters under the Exceed material monster as tokens. They're just there. They're not actually in play. They're just there due to a condition or an effect. Not an effect by this point, but a condition. So they're not actually there. They're just kind of there. It's hard to explain. But any monster that has an effect that says when this card is sent from the field to the graveyard will no longer be applied because it doesn't have an effect. It loses all of its conditions, all of its effects, its abilities, everything. They're gone. It's no longer a monster. It's no longer a card. It's just there. It's an Exceed material. So it's really interesting how they made this game mechanic, but I think it'll be pretty fun. It'll add a lot of variety into the game. But the reason they did this so you can't go tour the underworld, Sangan, blah 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 blah, crap, etc., etc. You get the point. Next, if Dandelion was used as an Exceed material monster, when it goes to the graveyard, do you get to special summon the token effect? When the Dandelion becomes an Exceed material monster and is sent to the grave, you will still get to special summon the token effect. The difference from the Sangan is it does not have to enter the graveyard from the field to get its effect. The same would apply to Jinzo Returner, DD Shout Plane, etc. Now this threw a lot of people for a loop. They're like, well, Sangan doesn't get its effect, why is DD? Because Dandelion doesn't give a crap where it's being sent from. It doesn't say field to graveyard. It says when this card hits the graveyard in any way, shape, or form. So it actually isn't bound to a field effect. That's why it gets past it. Because it hits the grave, then activates. Sangan and whatnot activate on the field. That's the problem. They miss their timing, essentially. And overall, I think that's good. Because a lot of the cards that say when this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, Gravekeeper Recruiter, Sangan, etc., I think could be pretty abusable if they still got their search and everything. If an Exceed material monster, if a machine monster is using an Exceed material and a Cyber Dragon is on the field, can you contact for Chimera Tech? No, it is no longer a card. It doesn't have a type. It doesn't have an effect. It's not a monster anymore. You cannot do that. Originally, there was a lot of stuff going around saying that if your opponent, like if I used 5 gadgets for an Exceed summon and I had a monster with 5 Exceed materials on it, you could go Cyber Dragon and Synchro to a 6000. No. They are no longer a card. They do not have a type. Period. You cannot do that. If you have an Exceed material monster on the field with Exceed materials and your opponent activates Secret Barrel, do you count the Exceed materials? No. You do not include the Exceed materials because they are technically not cards anymore. They are Exceed materials. They're technically not on the field. Like I said, they're counters basically. You don't use them or count them for any effect on the field. If it deals with the field, Exceed materials don't technically exist once they're on the monsters. They're counters. That's literally what they become. So understand that they do not count anymore. Other things mentioned are trap monsters can be used in Exceed summons, and they still go under the Exceed monster as Exceed materials. So Golgoth, the Moving Fortress, or whatever that stupid thing is, Zoma, the Spirit, stuff like that. Now, interestingly enough, tokens cannot be used for Exceed summons. Now, everyone said, what? You can't use tokens? Why? Tokens don't exist. They are not cards. You must use 2 cards of the same level to Exceed summon. Tokens are not cards. Now you're saying, well, why can trap monsters? Because trap monsters are cards. Zoma the Spirit is a trap card. It may not be a monster card, but it's a trap card. That's the special thing here. So tokens can go f*** themselves. That's all I gotta say to you. Exceed material monsters are not considered to be, Exceed material monsters are not, Exceed materials, I keep saying monsters, I apologize, Exceed materials are not considered to be on the field, similar to the rulings of Sangan. Therefore, you cannot target them with any effect. So you can't, if I Exceed summon, and say I Exceed summon, I don't know, say I Exceed summon with Zoma. Say I use Zoma and a gadget to get a 4-star Exceed. You cannot MST the Zoma. It no longer exists. It's a token. Are you going to MST a token? No. Now don't be like, yay, we can use Token Festival. I'm using it as an example, you jackasses. Anyway, people like to try and quote me on that. That's pretty much all there is to mention. Overall, I think they're going to be really interesting and really fun. And I'm looking forward to Exceeds, actually. So, keep dueling until next time, and this is the Gadget Guru, and I will catch you all later.